I'm in Springfield, Illinois, outside of the old state capitol, state historic site. This is the original state capitol building here in Springfield, and it is where Lincoln was a member of the House of Representatives and where his funeral was held. So we're gonna go check this out. Illinois was admitted to the Union in 1818, and the original capital was Kaskaskia, which had been the territorial capital. The capital was soon moved to a small town about 75 miles southeast of Springfield called Vandalia. Then in 1837 the capital was moved here to Springfield. Construction started on the new State House in 1837 and was only finally completed in 1853. It was designed by John Francis Rigg in the Greek Revival style, and it cost $260,000 at the time. It's constructed of a yellow limestone, which is pretty unique, and it was locally quarried from Sugar Creek. It was built right in the central square of Springfield, and this is where the Illinois General Assembly, the executive offices, and the Supreme Court met until 1876, when they moved to the new state capitol, which can be seen nearby, and I do have a separate video on the new capitol, by the way. After that, this building became the Sangamon County Courthouse until 1966, when it was restored and preserved as a museum in its 1860 appearance. Inside the old state capitol, they kept with the Greek Revival architecture, especially with all the Ionic columns, and it has a large central staircase under the Rotunda. It was a really nice building for 1840s Illinois, which could still be considered frontier. The cornerstone of this building was laid by the lawyer Edward Baker, who would end up becoming a very intimate friend of Lincoln's. He also became the first US Senator from Oregon and died during the Civil War. The building was altered and modernized when it was a courthouse, and when they transitioned it back to the way it was, the building was almost entirely taken apart and rebuilt. So it's hard to know how much of the structure and interior is truly original. This was the Auditor's office, which is where the state's treasury office worked out of. In 1842, the State Auditor of Public Accounts, James Shields, challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel, and Lincoln published some satirical letters attacking his official practices, but their seconds were able to set the record straight, so Lincoln didn't end up dueling. This is a Missouri constitutional rights flag that was captured by the members of the 16th Illinois Infantry from some rebels in Missouri in 1861. It was the first secessionist flag captured by an Illinois regiment during the Civil War, and it was displayed here in the Capitol building. This is a portrait of John Jones, who was a successful businessman in Chicago and worked to repeal the Illinois black laws in 1865 in order to obtain black suffrage in the state. This was before the 15th Amendment. This is the law library. Abraham Lincoln spent a lot of time in here, often researching and borrowing books for cases he was working on. He also would come in here to socialize and would famously distract other readers in here with this plethora of stories and jokes. That old barometer is really cool. All the rooms are filled with period or reproduction furniture. I don't believe that too much of it is original to the Capitol. And this is the entryway to the old Supreme Court chamber of Illinois. As Lincoln was an appellate lawyer, he and his original law partner John Todd Stewart, and later William Herndon, argued a lot of Supreme Court cases. In fact, Lincoln argued over 400 cases before the Supreme Court, most of them in this very chamber. Lincoln was very studious, and he took great lengths to prepare for cases. So as this Supreme Court was as slow as they are now, he really liked these cases because he had ample time to prepare for them. The state library was also housed in this building, and it's a pretty cool room. Back then, the Secretary of State was also the state librarian, so it is next to the Secretary of State's office. Abraham Lincoln was the first person to borrow a book from the Springfield State Library in 1842. He also was here regularly to do a lot of research and played many games of chess in this room. He also met John Nicolay here. He was a young man who would become one of his personal secretaries, along with John Hay, during most of the Lincoln presidency. That's a really old taxidermy bird box. I wonder if that's original. This is the Secretary of State office. Stephen Douglas did work in this office, as he was the Secretary of State from 1840 to 1841. Lyman Trumbull, who would later be a co-author of the 13th Amendment, succeeded Douglas. Lincoln was in this room on the eves of election days, going over election returns. Some he lost, like the 1858 Senate race, but others he won, like the 1860 presidential race. So those are the rooms on the first floor of the Capitol. Now we're going to go up the staircase, where the Rotunda comes into full view. While there's not a center in the opening, it is a lot like the Pantheon Rotunda. They also have some serious water damage in some parts of the Rotunda, so hope they can get the funding to fix that. In the Rotunda, there are Corinthian columns. There was one instance on this stairwell in 1860 when a friend of Lincoln's passed by Solomon P. Chase on these stairs. This was after Lincoln was the presidential nominee, and he was warned by his friend that Chase was full of himself and shouldn't be appointed to the cabinet. Lincoln did end up appointing Chase as Secretary of the Treasury and truly found out what he was warned of. And here is the Representative Hall, where the Illinois House of Representatives met for decades. This is the chamber where Lincoln spent his last term in the General Assembly in 1841, but that was not the last of his presence in this chamber. Of note, he gave a great eulogy for his Whig hero Henry Clay after his passing in 1852, and also refuted Stephen Douglas at many times. In 1858, Lincoln announced his candidacy for the Senate race with his famed House Divided speech, where he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Those words echoed off these very walls. That happened right here. Sorry, geeking out. Republicans also gathered in this chamber when Lincoln received the Republican presidential nomination from the Chicago Convention, and they were also in here the night he won the election in November. Sadly, that was the last joyous moment for Lincoln to occur in this chamber, as on May 3rd through May 4th of 1865, his remains were brought into the center of the emptied chamber to lay in state before the final funeral service at Oak Ridge Cemetery, and over 25,000 people came to pay their respects around the clock. Lincoln's desk location is believed to be right around here towards the back. While most of the furnishings are not original, that George Washington portrait is the one that hung when Lincoln was here and witnessed all the events and debates that took place in this chamber. Across the Rotunda is the entrance to the Senate chamber, where the Illinois State Senate met starting in 1840. Lincoln didn't serve in the Illinois Senate, so he wasn't in here much. At the center of the chamber is a portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette. This portrait, along with the Washington portrait in the Representative Chamber, are copies of the original James Berry portraits that still hang in the House of Representatives chamber at the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. Here are some tables for work in the back of the chamber. Along with the General Assembly, there are several other offices and some artifacts up here. This is a statue of Senator Stephen Douglas, the longtime rival of Lincoln here in Illinois. The statue is made of marble by Leonard Volk, the same sculptor who did Lincoln's life cast. Douglas did make a famous speech in the representative chamber in 1861, a few months before he died. He did spend the last months of his life urging people to save the Union, despite his differences with Lincoln, who beat him for the presidency. That flag was carried during the Civil War by the 95th Illinois Infantry Regiment of Volunteers, and this flag saw battle in Tennessee and Mississippi. This was the Adjutant General's office. In early 1861, Ulysses S. Grant of Galena, Illinois, worked in this office when he was asked by the governor to stay in Springfield to drill soldiers before going off to service in the Civil War, where he became Lincoln's favorite general, got the rank of lieutenant general, and eventually became president. There is yet another presidential connection to this place. In 2007, then Senator Barack Obama announced his candidacy for the presidency outside the old state capitol, following in the footsteps of Lincoln, who announced his candidacy in the representatives chamber. Obama later debuted Joe Biden as his vice presidential candidate from here as well. Inside this old committee room, there are some old Civil War rifles, and there are some swords and scabbards. This is the Public Instruction Office. Ninian Edwards, who is married to Mary Todd Lincoln's sister, was the first Illinois Superintendent of Public Instruction. That is an amazing piece of campaign history, a cloth campaign banner for Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin from 1860. This is the governor's reception room, the room where Abraham Lincoln received guests after he secured the 1860 presidential nomination. In this room he met with many people like his future Attorney General Edward Bates, Thurlow Weed, Francis Blair Jr., among many other important figures. And this was the governor's office, which was used by Yates and Oglesby. There's a portrait of Governor Richard Oglesby, and underneath it is a display on the foods, clothing, medicine, and other materials collected and shipped by the Springfield Aid Society. The Lady Soldiers Aid Society also created and collected lots of goods to supply military hospitals during the war. They made lots of clothing and bandages for the hospitals, and the Lady Society did sew garments in this room during the war. So that's Abraham Lincoln's Capitol. It is such an amazing building. Very few places give me the same feels of truly following in the footsteps of history like this place does. It's always incredible to go inside this building. Right across from the old state capitol on the old Central Square is another very historic building. This brick building housed the Lincoln-Herndon Law Office. The city has put up a metallic Christmas tree in front of it. While the building was clearly a commercial block that housed a dry goods store on the first floor, it is the only existing building where Lincoln had a law office. It was built in 1840 and also has a lot of Greek Revival elements. Lincoln and his law partner William Herndon practiced law in this building from 1843 to 1852. Lincoln did prepare and write most of his first inaugural address inside this law office in 1861 before he departed Springfield for Washington, D.C. This room shows what the Lincoln Law Office was like. It was remembered as being very plain and somewhat disorderly. The law office was on the third floor, and this setup used to be in the actual room upstairs. They used to give tours of this law office building when it was a state historic site. The Illinois Historic Preservation Division's budget has been slashed, so this was a historic site that got sacrificed. So unfortunately you can no longer actually go up and go into Lincoln's law office, so that's pretty disappointing. I remember this setup of an 1840s post office was also here when it was a state historic site. I don't know if this building actually housed a post office, but this is like the one Lincoln would have gone to during his days in Springfield. The first floor of this building is now the Springfield Chamber of Commerce Visitor Center, so at least you can visit it in some capacity. Outside on the old pedestrian street is a statue grouping of the Lincoln family, just as they appeared over 150 years ago. Mary is fixing up Lincoln's scruffy suit. and Abraham Lincoln stares out onto the Capitol building where he had so many important associations. His experiences there really shaped him to take on the great crises of the Civil War, and he also very much shaped the building as well. Also, their son Willie is with them, and he's waving across the street to his older brother Robert, who's walking by doing something else. I think he's just keeping away from the bad luck that would befall the other 3 members of his family over there. Abraham Lincoln was the representative who introduced the bill which moved the state capital from Vandalia to Springfield in 1837, so the fact that Springfield's the capital can be in many ways accredited to Abraham Lincoln. As this is a very historic spot, they have a whole wall of old plaques. There's one in honor of the pioneers, and another one memorializing the resulting Potawatomi Trail of Death, as they were displaced by the white pioneers. This square is also where the cannibalistic Donner Party departed in 1846. This is the very spot where they departed for their quote ill-fated journey to California, where they started eating each other. Lincoln did travel along this way during his time on the 8th Judicial District Circuit Court for a decade, and there's a plaque mentioning Stephen Douglas's Protect the Flag speech. This one mentions that President-elect Lincoln used the governor's reception office as his headquarters during the presidential transition, and that Ulysses S. Grant used the adjutant office for a bit. That's the Gettysburg Address in bronze, and the old Capitol was deservingly one of the first ever National Historic Landmarks. So that was the old state capitol, state historic site. If you enjoyed this video, I filmed a bunch of other videos at the Lincoln historic sites here in Springfield, as well as all over the country. So please go check those videos out, and thanks for watching.